Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Cunningham. I'm the AVP of Alumni Relations. And speaking of a mind at work, we're very lucky to have Professor Najar here today. She's going to talk to us about Eliza Hamilton. Professor Najar has been at Lehigh for 20 years and got her PhD from Wisconsin before she came to Lehigh. She is a professor in the College of Arts and Sciences and studies revolutionary and early national eras. So I just wanted to welcome everybody, go through a little bit of choreography before we get started with our webinar today. So the way that you will ask your questions is you go to the chat box that's at the bottom of your screen and just pop that open, and you can either put your message just to the panelists or to the panelists and all attendees. I prefer to all attendees because it's fun to see a back channel of you all kind of chatting amongst yourselves. And I will read those questions and comments aloud so that Professor Najar doesn't need to be trying to do both, read your questions and answer at the same time. So we will get started here in just a second, and we will end right at 1 o'clock. If you have additional questions, I'm happy to send those along, and Monica can answer them later. But let's get started. And you see the PowerPoint there up on your screen. And Professor Najar, take it away.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to everyone in Alumni Relations for putting this together, and you all for being with us today. So today I'm going to be talking less about Eliza Hamilton than about the age of Eliza Hamilton and women in politics in the early Republic. And as y'all know, in Lin Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, Angelica Schuyler sings, "I've been reading Common Sense" by Thomas Paine. "Some men think I'm intense or I'm insane." And I thought we'd use that part of the musical to start thinking about women's politics in the early Republic and in the Revolutionary era. And the case I'm going to be making to you, just very briefly, in I hope 8 minutes, is that Angelica Schuyler and her sister Eliza Schuyler Hamilton were deeply enmeshed in the politics of the Revolution and the new nation, and they were not alone. So today I want to put them into context. And I hope that recognizing the significant political work of women of this generation will feel as timely to you as it does to me. Timely because, of course, many of us got to see Hamilton this summer. Timely because of the current election. And timely because this year we commemorate 100 years of the 19th Amendment enshrining women's right to vote in the United States. So I'm going to sketch this out pretty quickly, but then we can talk about any piece that you find interesting in the question and answer period. So to start with, during the Revolution, women not only become explicitly political actors, but they were also recognized as such. And I think that recognition is really important for us to understand. So as you may know, their work was crucial to resisting the British during the Revolutionary era. Women were often the ones who bought goods, or they were the ones who boycotted those goods. And one of the things that lots of families boycotted during the Revolutionary era was cloth and linen. And so women then became responsible not just for participating in that boycott, but also for making homespun cloth. And that very simple cloth became a very visible symbol of resistance to Parliament. And women of all social ranks, even those who did not customarily weave their own clothes, did so when they wanted to identify themselves and their families with the Patriot movement. So in Newport, Rhode Island, for instance, 92 Daughters of Liberty got together. They brought 67 spinning wheels to one place, and they sat there working on their spinning wheels until they had made 170 pieces. Women claimed this political responsibility, and men recognized that it was women's responsibility too. In Boston, some 300 mistresses of families, as they called themselves, wrote into the newspaper to denounce the consumption of tea, another one of those major symbols of resistance to Parliament. So by the same token, inaction was also political. So I mentioned Newport, Rhode Island. Can you imagine if you have 92 Daughters of Liberty getting together in Newport, Rhode Island, and you live there too? You would notice who wasn't there, wouldn't you? And you'd talk about who wasn't there. And so whether or not you wore homespun, whether your husband wore homespun, would signal your politics and your family's politics. So there's not much room for neutrality here. People had to become, they were forced to become part of this political movement, either by participating or by not participating. Now, women's participation and the public recognition of that participation politicized the households during this time period. John Adams later recalled, was not every fireside indeed a theater of politics? And so many women, and here we have an assortment of women who were all engaged in politics at the time of the American Revolution. Many women were involved in this political work. Some of the ways that women might participate could be fairly unusual. There's famous stories about the Molly pitchers bringing water to men who were fighting. There were women who stayed home and ran their farms while their husbands or fathers or brothers were away. So that kind of work also involves women and connects them to the revolutionary ideology. And we can see that women themselves recognized that larger political theory. They understood both the terms of the debate, and they understood the methods of waging this resistance. And we see that in their writings, so that women would talk about the Declaration of Independence. They would talk about the importance of boycotts. They would talk about merchants who were hoarding goods and how that was disruptive to the American cause. And so some of these women are certainly women you would know. John Adams sent his wife a copy of the Declaration of Independence. Angelica Schuyler sent Thomas Jefferson a copy of the Federalist Papers, which she received from her sister, Eliza Hamilton. Women together enforced boycotts. And we can even in some cases see women representing the image of America. It became quite common to see women representing liberty and these become really quite consistent images, drawing from older images as well. I can go through these more slowly, but I think you have the gist. And so one other story I wanted to mention was a story of a 9-year-old girl who was the daughter of a patriot. And she was taken to visit the Tory governor, William Franklin. And when she was offered a cup of tea in his house, in his parlor, she curtsied and she threw the tea out the window. Now, okay, that story might be apocryphal, but what's interesting to me is that we know about it, not because her father had a heart attack and it was written up in the newspaper. We know about it because someone thought it was a good story to tell. Somebody thought that it was something to be proud of in terms of women and their commitment to revolutionary principles and their understanding of American resistance. So one of the ways that we can think through this is through Republicanism itself. Republicanism is the ideology that the Americans insisted they were fighting for and that they wanted to guide the new nation. And in many ways, Republicanism was a gendered ideology. The idea of Republicanism was that republics are inherently fragile. They don't survive, they fall apart. And the only way to protect them is political virtue. And political virtue, we think of that term now as about morality, which wasn't really what they meant. They meant much in the same way we would use the word accountability or courage today, where it can have moral aspects to it, but it can also have very civic meanings. So that's how they meant the word virtue. It meant you had the ability to put aside your self-interest on behalf of the common good. And how could anyone who is dependent put aside their self-interest? Only those who were independent could do so. Well, some women began to write themselves into this political ideology. They called themselves Republican mothers. Sometimes it's called Republican womanhood. So what we see in this ideology is that women insisted that the Republic would survive if there was a generation of women, a class of women who were educated, who were rational, who were moral and virtuous, and raised their children to be such. So it was a way for these women to continue to claim a Republican identity and a relationship to the state. But a lot of historians have noted that this idea, this opportunity for women to create a political identity for themselves doesn't last that long. By 1800, we can see a strong backlash against it. And so I have a few other slides, but I'm going to skip ahead and just show you one, which is this one. So let me just show you this slide. This slide, if you can see at the bottom there, it's called A Society of Patriotic Ladies. So if we want to think about this backlash, one of the ways we can think about it is through this picture. The seeds of this backlash certainly exist before 1800, and this is before 1800, but it helps us see one of those underlying philosophies about women in politics. And what do we see in it? What happens to women who are patriotic ladies? Well, the first thing my students always observe when I show this is patriotic ladies are not attractive. These, this poor woman on the right, patriotic ladies are not chaste, right? We can see that in the center of the picture. And when you look at the little baby who appears to be eaten by a dog, or, being bitten by a dog, we can also see patriotic ladies are not good mothers. So even as there is this group of elite women working very hard to claim a political identity for themselves, we can see some of the countercurrents to that and the ways in which women's politics were undermined during this very same period. So I'm going to stop there. Obviously, I have more slides and I could keep talking and I could go on for an hour, but I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to invite you all to ask any questions you want or anything you want to talk about together.
Fantastic. Thank you, Monica. I was thinking, man, what if Twitter and TikTok were, during that time? Just imagining the tea throwing, like what that would be on Snapchat. But
exactly. It's a good story.
Stephen Freed has a great question. Did John Adams send his wife the Declaration for review and comment purposes, or for knowledge, or for some other reason? Do we know?
It's a great question. Yeah, he sent it to her because he was always talking about politics with her. They had, all right, so if I can, I'm going to flip back and show you one of the other slides. I do love these slides. So they always talked about politics together, and he trusted her judgment. She was responsible for the farm. She was making a lot of decisions about things like inoculation, which you might know was really controversial and dangerous during the Revolution. And when Abigail Adams writes back to him, she is talking about politics, and she's employing those politics in, I think, really interesting ways. So this is one of the famous letters that she writes to him, where she says, "Remember the ladies. Don't put such unlimited power in the hands of their husbands." And this is the piece I think is really interesting, that last sentence. "If particular care and attention is not paid the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So she understands that principle of representation, right? If we don't have representation, those laws do not apply to us. And maybe we can get another little sense of what John Adams was thinking when he responds. He says, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh." And he says, we've been warned that when we pass this Declaration of Independence, all kinds of things are going to happen. This revolution is going to spill out of control, but depend upon it. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Now, when I show my students this, they often say they don't like John Adams, right? But I wonder if he's kidding a little bit here. I don't know that he's saying, I cannot but laugh at you for having that belief. I think they are teasing each other a little bit. And when we look at some of the ways he addresses her and how familiar they are about politics, when we look at that larger context in which he's very clearly talking about politics with her regularly, I think it leaves us with a sense that it wasn't quite as negative as it might first seem.
I love Rob Kaufman's question. Why did women put up with being pushed out of the forefront of politics? Yes, I had the same question. Why did they not use their unspoken power over their husbands to push back?
It's a fantastic question. Thank you so much. So there's a couple of reasons for it. First, we'd want to note that the way the women wrote themselves into politics, there's a number of ways that they could have done so. And we know that because other people were writing themselves into the revolutionary process. For instance, working men were not independent, right? They could be fired. So could they be true Republicans? They said yes. They said, we work, therefore we're citizens. We served, therefore we're citizens. Women could have done the same thing, but instead what they did was they said, we are mothers, not workers. And they were workers, right? Any one of us who's familiar with a farm knows how important everybody's labor is. So they were workers and they knew they were workers. So they could have said that, but they don't. They say, we are mothers. And that ideology of motherhood ends up having two sides to the same coin. On the one hand, it authorizes them to get involved in things like temperance. It authorizes them to get involved, but on the other hand, it specifically associates them with children and eventually with a household and what's seen as a private sphere. So that's one of the big reasons why they don't. And the other thing, again, a really excellent question and a complicated one. One of the other things is that danger of being called a public woman. So that argument that a woman of a masculine mind has masculine habits. The threat that women unsex themselves by being engaged in this kind of work has a lot of currency, and there's a lot of threat underneath it. That you will lose the protections of your sex, which could mean anything if you engage in these politics.
Yeah, and then there's a couple questions here about, Martha says, early on women could vote under the Articles of the Constitution and Federation. How did they lose it? Susan says the only state that gave the women right to vote was New Jersey in the 18th century, but it was rescinded in the early 19th century. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Only one state has room for women to vote. And it seems, the reason why it happened in the first place is this argument about republicanism. These folks were true believers. Now, what they believed was, if you have property, you are able to exercise rights on behalf of the common good. If you have property, you are secure enough to say, I'm not going to worry about what's best for me. I'm going to do what's best for the nation, right? And that's still an ideology that has a lot of currency in American politics, but it's one that privileges the wealthy. And so for some folks at the very beginning, without really thinking about gender, what they were thinking about is property owners. Married women legally couldn't own property. So this opportunity for women to vote was was in many ways just an accident of that moment in which they were thinking about independence and who is independent. But when it becomes clear that this might open the door to women voting, women representing their own political values, they do work to shut that down, and that is eliminated. That opportunity to vote is eliminated.
Really? Guy's question, interesting that we were then known as a republic. When did that concept get lost and everyone thinks we're now a democracy?
Right, yeah, another great question. Pretty quickly, you know, when I said that those working folks wrote themselves into the idea of citizenship, that does keep spreading. I mean, the revolutionary promise of the Declaration of Independence is staggering. And we could do a whole talk on how different groups relate to that and claim it for themselves. And it's working men who do it first, and they're increasingly granted the vote. So you don't need to have property to vote. And that happens first on the frontier in the 1790s, and then it spreads throughout all of the former colonies. And by about 1815, we start to see more and more states where it's universal white manhood suffrage, and that's when people start talking about democracy as a positive thing. One man, one vote. And that is not something to be afraid of, but it's a positive thing. And really historians pick Andrew Jackson as one of those big moments. It's during his campaign of 1824 when he really starts to talk about that the common man is the best marker of what we should be doing in the United States. So it's associated with the 1820s.
Interesting. Cynthia's question is, do you have any favorite historical fiction books regarding strong women in history?
Oh, what a great question.
Or maybe you can send us a list that we can send out to everyone, because I'm sure there's probably more than one, but if one comes to your head now, tell us, but we can send it out later.
Yeah, why don't you let me send it out later? Some wonderful fiction books came to my head, and a wonderful book on Eliza Schuyler Hamilton has also come out, and that's a very intimate portrait. So it feels a little, and in fact maybe is a little fictiony, but still fascinating, very interesting book. So yes, if I could think about that, I would be happy to send that. And anyone, you know, I'll say this now, but it's certainly true at the end of our talk as well. Anyone is welcome to reach me at my last name, Najar, at lehigh.edu. And if you just send me an email, I'll send you some thoughts on things I've enjoyed.
Great. Sarah's question, she says, like a lot of us, since I knew very little about these women until the musical, can you tell us more about Eliza and Angelica's relationships? Mm-hmm. Sounds like Angelica was more of an activist and Eliza was behind the scenes.
That's true in a lot of ways. They are amazing women, part of this amazing generation. Angelica Schuyler Church was, I think that the musical accurately suggests she is a little bit more forward. She corresponded with people. She took on Thomas Jefferson. She teased her sister about how much she liked her sister's husband, and really was very, very political. Eliza's letters are less political, but we know she was deeply involved in politics all of the same. So Alexander Hamilton, as you may know, was involved in finances and how do you pay for the debt of the American Revolution and what's the best way to make sure the United States is financially solvent. And so he wrote a long financial report that establishes him as one of the great thinkers on this issue. And dozens of the pages are in Eliza's hand. So she's there with him as he's writing it. Now, does she change any of his wording? I can't say, but it's very clear she's involved in his work. She was a go-between when he was working with publishers on the Federalist Papers. And of course, as the musical shows, she was incredibly important in making sure that Alexander Hamilton was recognized as one of the founders of the nation in an age when it was easy to focus primarily on presidents. And she didn't want that to happen. So she wanted to be sure that his legacy, his work on the bank, his work on the Federalist Papers was understood as part of the founding moment of the United States.
Great. Stephanie's asking us to back up a little bit and explain how people wrote themselves in to those who the right to vote extended, and explain maybe in less academic terms how women backed away from this, or in the case of New Jersey, how the rights were pulled away from them. Right. So just kind of going back, like it would be awesome if people now could we just write ourselves in to fair pay and all the other things.
Wouldn't that be, well, so I think this is important because in some ways we can. I think it's really important that when we study history, we understand how much various people change the world. And they do write themselves in, right? And that's what we see in the civil rights movement and Rosa Parks, about writing yourself into, right? So I do think that's important. That isn't to deny the structural challenges, the walls that people hit again and again and again. And so it's the next generation or the next generation that is continuing that fight. So let me answer the first part of that, which is how do they do it? One of the ways that this group does it is they write treatises. Women like Judith Sargent Murray. So I can go back to some of those earlier women. Well, there's Judith Sargent Murray, but just in case you don't know, some of the women in this picture, we have at the bottom in the bonnet, that is Mercy Otis Warren. And next to her in the middle at the bottom is Judith Sargent Murray. So what those two women did is they write treatises. And in those treatises, they made arguments about how is the Republic going to survive? What is the nature of this liberty? And how is it going to be protected? And they made the arguments that virtue has to be understood as something that women can protect in their homes, in their work, in raising their children. And really, it's important that it was also in their work. Women are citizens too. So in some cases, it is that kind of direct treatise. The other two women who are there that you might know about are Martha Washington and Abigail Adams. And at the top, we have Phyllis Wheatley, a poet who during the American Revolution, she was an enslaved woman. And during the American Revolution, or I should say during the Revolutionary era, she engaged in politics and claimed for herself a voice, a poet's voice, on issues of Christianity and on issues of the nation and right behavior. And so she's a writer who is engaged in this as well. For Abigail Adams and Martha Washington, part of what they did, and you tell me what you think of this. This is the case I'm going to make you. This is what historians would say. They would say that they, by having salons, by hosting the dinners that were the place of politics in the early Republic, that they became the voice of the civility necessary to maintain the Republic. So that sounds a little, they threw a party. That's how political can that be? They threw a party. And I get that argument, I do. And I think it's a fair one. The case that some scholars would make is that because of how this generation understood republicanism, that civility was necessary for the Republic to survive. If everyone competes on their own, the United States will go the way of every other republic and it will die. And so these salons that they held, a place to discuss politics with people, were central to that mission. So I'd be curious if you found that persuasive. It's not an argument everyone accepts, and but I think it's an interesting one. I hope that helps.
Very interesting. Stephanie continued on with a question, but we're not going to be able to get to it because it is 1 o'clock already. Her question was about the ERA. So perhaps we can get your perspective on that and another time, but that is a fascinating idea. So,
absolutely.
Well, Professor Najar, we thank you so much for your time. And we had 46 people on today, a really nice crowd. I hope everyone learned a lot. I certainly did, and enjoyed today's webinar. Again, we will send you all a recording of this in case you joined late or had to check out early. And thank you again.
Thank you so much.